All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to focus on a particular set of semantic HTML elements, particularly headings and semantic sectioning elements. So these kinds of elements are particularly important when you're making web pages that you want to be navigable and accessible to screen readers. So again, we're just basically, we're not adding any new syntax, we're just introducing a couple of different HTML elements that are going to sort of fit into our HTML element documents the same way we talked about before. So first, we're going to start about talking about headings and sort of how they build into outlines, just kind of to clarify how that works a little bit. And then we'll talk about introducing this idea of semantic sectioning elements and go over what some of those elements are. Okay, so the basic idea, and we've mentioned this before, is that these heading elements, so H1s, H2s, H3s, etc., are used to basically indicate the structure of your web page. So what headings are really used to do is they're used to create something similar to a table of contents for your website. They're basically used to create like an outline of what the page might be. So HTML is really designed around textual documents. So it's really designed for things like newspaper articles and books and like how you'd actually want to think about writing like doc style documents. So H1s and H2s and H3s are used to indicate effectively titles and chapters and sections and subsections of your page. So the H1 is generally going to use to indicate sort of the title. Think of it almost as like the chapter name or the sort of the title of your book. Let's see. So we'll call H1. We'll call that the title of your page. You'll often have one single H1 on your web page. You'll almost never have more than one of these H1s because your web page only has one title. Some of your book might only have one title, right? You don't get halfway through a book and then get to the next title unless you're reading like an anthology or something, and they may be multiple titles, that might be something else. So H1s are like the titles. H2s would then be like the chapter names inside that book. H3s would then be the sections in that chapter, right? H4s are then the subsections in that chapter. You can actually see exactly this if you go look at the right. If you go look at the sort of 340 course text, one of the textbooks readings we have, right, it's broken up into these different chapters, right? We can, for example, look at our accessibility and standards chapter, HTML fundamentals chapter, right? Each one of these is a chapter. If we actually open this up in our developer tools, so again, I'm going to go view developer and developer tools. We scroll down away and we go dig things around a little bit. We can actually see that this chapter 3 here is an H1 element, right? That's my title for my chapter. If we navigate down to then the sort of the next section, 3.1, right, we go see what that thing is. That thing there is an H2 element, right? That's the next section down. Do I have any further sections down in this section? Right. Oh, there's some example elements, right? Jumping down there. That's our H3, right? It's another subsection of our page. So the H1, H2, H3s are really intended to produce this kind of outline, this kind of table of contents of your page. When you're thinking through what these headings should be, I often either try to think about it as very much like if I was writing this as a book or as an article of some kind, where would I want to put those section titles, those headings? Sometimes it's useful if you want to think about this literally like you're writing an outline. So if you can remember back to like you've taken the English level courses and you've had to make like formal outlines, right? You got like first when you have your introduction, your intro, and then you might have your sort of your like first paragraph of evidence. I'm trying to think back to like literally like when you had to like write your like essay for like your like middle school class, right? And then inside of that you had your sort of your first point. And then you had, some other piece that came across there, some other thing, right? And then eventually you then would have some details here, right? This kind of outline, I'm probably getting the structure wrong because it's been a while since I've done this, but this kind of outline, right? That's my H1. That's, well, maybe we're in H2, right? That's in a heading. This would be the next heading down, the H2. This one, the next one down, the H3, and so on and so forth. Like that's how we build out what this thing looks like. I'll save that. So you really going to want to think about writing these headings when you're kind of producing this table of contents. It's important for accessibility reasons, that when you're creating this table of contents, you don't skip levels. So you don't have an H1 and then somewhere further down the page have an H3 without having an H2 kind of in the middle somewhere, right? Between those two things, right? You don't want to have those sections. Just like if you're writing a table, if you're writing a book, you don't want to have like chapter 1, or chapter 3, and then section 3.2, 3.2.1 without ever having gotten to section 3.1, right? You don't want to ever have to like skip that heading level because it makes it both hard to understand the outline and it makes it hard to sort of for screen readers to navigate through this content. What a screen reader will do is a screen reader will be able to jump through these headings and use that to actually like jump around in the page, because if you're a blind user, you can't scroll down looking for these things, so you have to sort of listen to them textually being read to you in order to see how that comes together. So yeah, so we're use your H1s, I don't want to say sparingly, but we want to use them meaningfully, and we want to use them to produce this table of contents without producing these levels. So these are where we use headings. The other thing we can use to then organize our web page is using what are called semantic sectioning elements. So these are, I mean, they've been introduced to HTML in the last like 10 years, so they're not super, they're kind of new, but they're not really that new. But what a sectioning element does is it works a little bit like a div. And if you remember what we talked about previously, like a div was an element that was used to group together other elements, right? But it had no semantic meaning or no appearance meaning on its own. What a sectioning element is it's like a div, right? It's used to group together parts of my page, right? Parts of my other elements, but it actually does have some semantic meaning. It has no appearance-based meaning, right? It doesn't produce any appearance level work, but it does actually produce some semantic meaning that can then be used by screen readers to help with navigation. And so these sectioning elements are used to break your page up into sections, into parts of your page. And there's a couple of different ones we can have. There's a header element. The header element is going to act as the banner for your page. It's the top part of your web page, right? If you go look at any web page in the world, right, you go look at the iSchool, right, the stuff that's sort of showing up at the top, right, the things that you sort of has like the name of the web page, maybe some navigation elements, right, that thing there, that's generally the banner. If you go look at Google, right, this section here, right, that's probably going to be the banner. It's got kind of the title of our page. And actually, I bet if we go look at it, maybe I'm going to be there. Yeah, no, they didn't actually use semantic sectioning because Google doesn't know what they're doing. But that kind of thing here, right, that's probably what I would call the banner of the page, the heading of the page. So generally the headers elements are going to go around your H1. That's the most common way you do this, right? So I might indicate that I want this thing to be a header element, or inside a header element, right? There's my H1. There's my example here, right? If I refresh the page, nothing changes in appearance, right? There's no appearance that comes built into this, but it does let the screen readers and users and any other like systems know that that thing there is like not really page content, like it's not important content. That's more of just gonna like tell you, you know, that's like the cover page, right? It's the sort of the cover of the book, right? It's giving you information about what this thing is, but it's not the actual content itself. So that's what our header elements are doing. Similarly with header, we then have the main elements, and main elements are used to organize all of that main content of our page. The stuff that's not part of the header, but it's going to be like, that's the actual body. That's the stuff we care about. Now, this doesn't mean the body of our web page, right? Because our web page can have a body element, and the header goes inside the body. Right? The body is any visual content. But saying like, oh, here's all this extra content, right? That's the main part of my page. It's the stuff that matters. So that content there could go inside of a main element. That goes inside of our main. Again, this has no appearance information on its own, but it does provide this semantic meaning so that screen readers can be able to say, jump to the main part of their page. So they know that, like, okay, I can skip all the text that's involved in the heading and the title and the author and the navigation, all that stuff that goes up in the heading. I can skip all that and jump down to the main section if I want to go find the actual content of my page. Generally, after a header and then a main, you'll have what's called the footer. And the footer is the thing that generally goes, not always, but usually at the bottom of the page. And the footer contains sort of the like extra details about the page, generally things like contact information, author information, right? Who built it, why it works, how that all comes together. That's the stuff that happens in the footer, right? If we look at the iSchool's webpage, right, we got our header. Here's all of our main content, right? All our stuff, there's various content on all of our pages, and then eventually you get to the footers, and this one actually may have in two different footers, right? There's sort of the footers are going to have sort of some links to like, here's stuff sort of about us, to find us on social media, right? Here's kind of contact us information, and then here's kind of the copyright information, right? Who made the page, where it comes from, phone numbers, right? These things here are the footers of our page. A footer doesn't need to be at the bottom of a page, technically. Like, I know it's called footer, I know that's called a header, but that doesn't actually mean the header needs to be at the top and the footer needs to be at the bottom. It's very much possible to put the header at the bottom, the footer at the top. It's kind of weird to do that. It's not very common. It's the same way you don't put like the title of the book at the end of the book. But you know, you do the movies, or sometimes the title goes at the end. So like it is possible to do that things, but generally footers are going to go at the bottom. Right. So we can put our footer here. And I might put things like I might put a copyright that this is Ross, right? That's the one who made it. And then I can put my little, you know, I've now got my contact information here to say like who wrote the thing. I don't know why I put a semicolon there. That was very silly. The thing that I need to note, and that students often get really confused, struggle with a little bit, is that the footer still goes inside of the body, right? It's still visible content. It's just our way of organizing that paragraph. We're saying that paragraph here, right? This set of content, it's part of the footer. It's part of this contact information. It's part of like, tell me who wrote the page, right? Where does this thing come from? That's what goes inside of the footer. All right. We got some, so these are the main sectioning elements you'll use, right? You can break up, you'll want your header to be sort of like what's the top part, the sort of unimportant content, not unimportant, but sort of just like the about content without actually telling us, you know, the main thing we care about. The main element that has the actual content we're interested in and what we actually want to do with things. And then we have our footer that contains things like the author information, the contact information, where that information came from. Okay. There are a couple other sectioning elements we can use as well. There is an example of what's called a nav element, which are used to provide navigation elements. So for example, if you have like a nav bar up here, right, or you even just have a list of links down here, right, those are all navigation elements. So a nav would be like, for example, if I have a bunch of links here, I might think about putting these things inside of a nav to indicate that this section here, right, this part of my page is a navigation part of my page. Screeners can then use this, will then be able to use this to be able to say jump to navigations or I guess when nav maybe skip over that navigation if it's actually not going to let me be able to help me navigate throughout the page. It's probably not a great nav example because these are actually links to elsewhere. They're not navigation within the current page. So it's probably not great to put a nav there. Navigations can show up anywhere, right? We could, for example, often you'll see this, you might have a nav inside of the header, right? And so my nav inside of my header could, for example, contain a link to say the like, I've got a research page, you know, if we want to talk about like research or something like that, or teaching is really, I don't do research. Right. So I could have a link to say like some other web page that I'm interested in. Right. And that's gonna be part of my navigation so that if a screener is reading through about me and my content, they can sort of just skip the list of the 20 different links that go to 20 different parts of our page, right? A screen reader can skip all of this stuff. It doesn't have to read through every single possible hyperlink here. It can just be able to say, jump down to the stuff and actually learn about, for example, like our fighting misinformation programs. So again, your web page can have multiple navs. Navs can go, sorry, there it is. You can have multiple navs. Often there'll be one in the header, but not always, right? Sometimes your header is like the banner, but then the navigation goes below that, right? Sometimes you might think of like, okay, here's the information about the page and the navigation's below it or above it, right? These things can be distinct from each other. Header doesn't need to be first, footer doesn't need to be last. They often are, but they don't have to be. There's nothing that says where they need to go. So the nav can be in the header. You can have multiple navs, right? You can have navigations that lead, you know, sidebar navigation, top navigation, lots of different kinds of navigations. That's okay. Okay. You can also have what are called section elements. And this is where our wording gets a little bit careful. We have to be careful of this, right? When we talk about sections of a page, we often think to like parts of a page, which can be like the div. So I might talk about the main section of my page or the header section or the footer section, because I'm using the word section to mean like a part. But there's also a technical formal section element, right? A section element. And it would look like section. And what you'll use a section for is, again, in place of a div, right? Because sections can then basically, again, ways of, all these elements are ways, basically replacements for div. They're ways of grouping elements together with some semantic meaning. And so our section might say that this is a part of my web page. Basically, when you think about sections, we really want to think about sections are parts of the page that would deserve to appear in that outline that we are creating from our web page, right? Anything that would deserve a heading, like an H1 or H2 or H3, that could be a section. And a section can actually have its own header as well, right? So I could actually say that this section has its own, like there's its heading, right? That's why it's got its own entry in the table of contents, therefore it's a section. And I could actually indicate if I wanted to that this H2 is the header of that section. You don't have a main of a section, but we can then break that apart. That said, right, just because we're introducing things like, so this might be a section. Similarly, this links down here, that could be a section as well. I might have multiple sections in my page. But just as we have sections, just because we're replacing our divs with sections and mains, doesn't mean that we won't have div elements, right? Because sometimes we have things that are, we want to group them together, but they're not their own distinct sections. So for example, maybe I want to group these links together, right? Because these two links are textbooks, right? So I might want to make these two things into a div, right? Or these are going to be the textbook links, for example. And again, we'll talk about this class stuff later. But that's basically a way of noting what these things are. So I'm not saying this thing is its own section because I wouldn't put a heading in here, right? I wouldn't put like a subheading where it's like, oh, these are the textbook links, because like there's not that many, they're not that complex. I don't actually want to start breaking it up in that way. So it's not a section right here. It's just going to be a div that lets me group together so that I can style these textbook link areas in their own special way. Again, I can use divs for styling, but I can use, if I'm going to have a div that actually has some semantic meaning behind it, I could replace that div with one of these sectioning elements. Okay. The last thing that exists that's not really common, but does exist and it's worth noting because it's part of this set of elements, is what's called an article element. So an article technically is something that is self-contained and republishable. So it is a section that literally you can lift out of that web page and put it into another web page, embed it somewhere else, and it would still all make sense. This is most commonly used for things like, if you imagine like a newspaper article or a blog entry, for example, that thing there, that newspaper article could be lifted out of the newspaper and put into another web page, right? We hosted that together. I actually think that often when you see things like social media posts, that, where you can like take your Twitter post, your Instagram post or whatever, and you're going to like embed that in another page. That's what an article is, right? The article is something that you could think of it literally like, I'm just going to include this Instagram post inside of some other web page. And that's really what an article might be. So articles make sense if you're writing things like news articles, or you're writing things like blog posts, or you're sort of really making like structured documents that have kind of repeated articles that come out, right? The way we think about using the word article in English normally. That's when you might use an article element. That said, it's pretty rare for a lot of the kinds of things that we'll often do, a lot of kinds of things you may end up finding you're doing yourself. So generally, you're really going to be wanting to think about, okay, I'm going to have my sections that surround my headings, and then I have my header, my main, and my footer that sort of provide the overall scaffold for what my web page is going to be. So again, these are all, think of them as like special divs, right? They're special ways of grouping content where we're grouping it not only because I want to group it together to style it, but I want to group it together because it has some semantic meaning, right? There's some purpose behind this, and they provide this extra level of navigation that helps with screen readers to be able to sort of move their way through the page. And then again, not every div needs to be a sectioning element. There can just be divs just for appearance and grouping and styling. And then sections, or things we call sections, really are things that would deserve a heading, an H1 or H2 or H3 and so on. Okay. The last thing that I want to note here is we've talked about headings. We talked about the header. And we've previously also talked about the head element. So this is one of these things that happens in programming, it happens in web in particular, is where we're going to use the same word or really similar words to refer to a lot of different things. We saw this with link, right? We talked about links as hyperlinks, but also link as like linking in a CSS or a link element. So there's actually 3 different elements in HTML that all have really similar names. We've got the head, a heading, which is an H1 or H2, and then a header element. And these all mean different things, right? The head is metadata about the page, right? It's not actually content. It's things about like who the author is, like from the page, what the page is like, browser title is going to be, the character, like whether it's written in like what character set it's using, search engine stuff, right? It's basically going to tell us things about the document itself without actually showing content. So that's our head. So the head is not the top of the page. It's like the top of the document, but it's not the top of sort of our content. A heading, right? And again, here's the ing, right? Heading are used to then provide this outline of our page, right? Those are our table of contents level structures. A header, distinct from a heading, a header is then, again, the semantic sectioning element that will potentially include a heading inside of it. But it's basically used to interface this, provides this sort of this top section, the banner, the sort of in-page title of our page. So these are all different things. And what often happens is that when we're communicating, we're talking to other people and other web developers, and we want to talk about how our page is structured. When you're reading through instructions on an assignment, when you want to talk to your developer because you want to say, here's why I want to restructure my page, we want to be careful about which verb form we're using, right? Are we talking about the head, the heading, or a header? And these, again, they're just different forms of the same verb, but they all mean slightly different things. So if I tell someone, put some content inside the head, that means something very different if I say put some content inside the heading or inside the header, right? Those all mean different things. So we want to be precise about the language that we're using when we're referring to these different kinds of elements. And so this is one of these weird things in programming, is that we often have to be really precise when we use particular words, but because we are human and we are talking to each other about code, we will often not be precise because the English language is not a precise language. So I'll often say, like, grab a heading, or I throw this in the header, without necessarily actually having a header element, just thinking sort of like that's the top part of the page. You say the same thing with links. When I say add a link, I don't mean necessarily, well, the question is, do I mean adding a link element, like for a style sheet, or do I mean adding a hyperlink? And we got to be sort of just careful about how we're communicating. And if we're ever not sure, if there's ever any kind of like doubt about what word we're using, we just want to check and confirm, okay, did you really mean the heading, or did you mean a header, or did you mean the head? Which one were you talking about? And again, when we communicate with other people, we often will have to get this kind of confirmation, and that's okay. That's part of talking to other people, and that's part of what's needed when we're building out web systems and we're building these things together. Great. So again, the main takeaways here is that we have these different kinds of sections that we want to be able to make our page navigable and accessible in order to support these screen readers by including these kinds of elements like headings and sections in order to make it so that our page is well structured and organized, so that screen readers are able to move around and navigate through the web page effectively without getting lost, without having to sort of be able to have to listen to the entire page and try to create a map of what they're trying to do.